Hello and welcome to psych319 Chapter 3 Part 2. I asked you to recently complete a dichotic listening demo, and what you probably noticed if you did that is that I changed some physical properties in the unattended channel, which made it really obvious when you might actually start paying attention to the unattended channel, which sort of brings in the notion of other theories of attention. So there were some experiments in dichotic listening where speech in the unattended channel would switch to backwards speech, and sometimes people would notice that switch, and when they notice the switch, the performance for the task in the attended channel dropped. So it shows you that your attention sort of was robbed or captured by the unattended channel for a brief moment, and that was probably due to the fact that they noticed physical properties in the changes to the speech in the unattended channel. So Treisman also came up with a theory that discussed and addressed this sort of issue. She's mentioned about speech. There's three components to speech. The physical properties, or speech sounds, the linguistic properties, meaning the smallest elements that speech forms, the phonemes. More importantly, the semantic properties of words. So you have physical properties of words, and the sounds, and then the meanings. And as I mentioned earlier, these might be filtered at different stages in the brain, and that's what Treisman believed was going on. So if two streams are physically different, we can easily reject the unattended message. But if they're semantically different, it requires a little bit of effort. So according to Treisman, semantics are processed, but to very different degrees. So your name might be processed because it's a very important word for you, but rare words are not processed. And I'll give you an example of why you might process your name. Your name is considered a primed word, and priming just means that you have a lot of history, which would lead to an easy ability to detect that word. Priming is based on word frequency and associations between that word and meaningful things in your life. This is Ann Treisman's theory, a little cartoon showing that perception for some things might be blocked quite early, and perceptions for others might make it past a stage of content analysis and get blocked later. But let me give you an example of semantic priming. So I'm going to show you some words, and I want you to tell me what you think of next. Of course, I can't hear you. Money, ATM, a teller, a safe. What's the next word you're thinking of? If you're like most people, you probably thought bank, right? Because the association between money, ATM, teller, safe, and so on. So we see that these words, money, ATM, and teller, prime the word bank. Bank is more likely to come into mind based on the words that were previously given to you. Another example, meadow, ocean, lake, river. What's the word that comes into your head? Was it riverbed? Probably bank. I mean, bed is probably just as likely as bank to occur if I just said river, but given that we primed it with the word bank from the previous demo, very likely river bank was what you were thinking of as well. So different things can prime the same word, but that's kind of how it works in the cocktail party phenomenon with your name being primed. Your name is very important to you. You hear it in many different contexts, and therefore, in a crowded room of people, your threshold to detect the name is very low. You're very sensitive to that name. The name is highly primed, and therefore it makes it probably all the way to the level of analysis for meaning before you decide whether to pay attention to it or not. And then there's one last extreme view of attention. This is late selection theory, proposed by Deutsch and Deutsch. Now, late detection assumes that all streams are processed without capacity limits, completely, no attenuation whatsoever. And this is highly unlikely because, first of all, that means that we have to have an enormous amount of capacity in the brain to attend to all the information that exists. So even though there's plenty of evidence that the unattended channel is processed, it's often at a cost of processing the attended channel. So if you switch between channels, your ability to attend to the channel that the ability to process information in the unattended channel, regardless of what channel that is, is very, very poor. So it seems like we're switching back and forth between channels, and it's very unlikely that we're processing all channels at a semantic level. So again, switching appears to be occurring. So all this talk of attention, and many of us have sort of operated under the illusion that we can do many things at once. And before I get to the idea of multitasking, I want to talk about attentional resources and attention and effort. So this is a standard performance arousal curve. If you're barely awake, chances are your performance on an attention-demanding task is pretty low. Likewise, if you're super hyper alert and nervous, your attention to that task is going to be difficult. Think about something like playing the piano. If you're not aroused enough, you're barely awake, you haven't had coffee, you just woke up from a nap, you're not going to give a very good piano performance. And then somewhere in the middle of the day, you may, if you had enough sleep and you're totally alert and awake, your performance is going to be at its peak. But then wait, if you had too many cups of coffee, or you're super, super nervous about a performance, you're highly, highly alert and aroused, your performance may also suffer. So we have this sort of optimal level of arousal that allows us to do a task well. I wanted to hint to this idea that attention is a limited resource. Think of it like a pool. Like you have a certain number of plants that need to be watered, and you only have enough water in the pitcher. You can only give enough water to a certain number of plants. You can either give all the plants a little bit of water, or you give one plant a lot of water. And that's kind of how we distribute our attention. So Kahneman proposed that the degree of attentional resources is limited by vigilance. Remember how we were talking about all these other forms of attention? Well, vigilance is incredibly important. If you haven't had a good night's sleep, you're not going to be very vigilant, and then you're going to have less resources to devote to attention-demanding tasks. And then this is what I described here also. Vigilance can also increase with task difficulty. Attentional resources increase with interest, immediate needs, and estimated difficulty. So if you're really interested in something, you tend to be able to be more vigilant, and therefore can dedicate more resources to that thing, whatever it is. If it's boring, then you're going to be bored, you're not going to be vigilant, and then you're not going to be able to pay attention to that thing. So going from top to bottom, here's that general idea in a graphical form. You have this sort of vigilance, manifestations of arousal, your available capacity, and all these things eventually contribute to the number of activities that you are doing via some kind of complicated allocation policy. So you can either distribute that attention evenly across a lot of things or towards one thing very well. But really, you're not really distributing across a lot of things. You tend to be switching between things really rapidly. We'll get to that. So here's another demo. Here, I want you to count the number. There's going to be two teams playing basketball, and they're going to be passing a ball between the members of the same team. One team is dressed in white, and one is dressed in black. I want you to pay attention to the team dressed in white and count how many times they pass the basketball back and forth to each other. So again, pay attention to the team in white. It's going to be very hard. There's two basketballs. All right, winding down. Okay, so there are a number of passes there, and if you got a lot correct, I believe there was 20 passes, if you got almost 20, then it's very likely that you missed the fact that there was a woman walking across the center of the screen with an umbrella. And this illusion, usually a lot of people fall for this. The more attention you pay to the team dressed in white, the easier it is for you to ignore anything else that's going on in the scene. And that's, again, the idea of the selective attention, paying attention to one stream of information, processing, and ignoring another channel. So this was an experiment conducted by Neisser in '76, and this just describes what they were doing here. I'm going to skip over this since you actually had experienced it yourself. So this is not a ridiculous notion, this demo here. We experience this every day. Again, think of all the things in the room that you're not paying attention to because you're listening to this slideshow. So we ignore more of the world than we actually attend to. This obviously has a lot of implications in technology. As you know, it's illegal to drive, at least in California. I'm not sure about New York. It's illegal to drive while using a cell phone. And the reason is you're paying exclusive attention to whatever's going on the phone at the expense of everything around you, and you could very well miss a pedestrian crossing in front of you. So I ask you the question, do you think a hands-free device solves the problem? Most likely it doesn't, because it's not an issue of using your hands, it's an issue of the brain. It's an issue of where you can pay attention and how many resources you have to allocate to a particular task. And if you're paying attention to the cell phone, you can't pay attention to your driving. So then another question, follow-up, what's the difference between talking to a person on the phone versus talking to a person in the car? People in the car, you can have a conversation and not run into anybody if that person's in the car. And the answer to that is that when you're on when someone's talking to you in the car, they're also in the same environment that you're in. So their conversation will break and pause if they see something happening in the environment. Many of you have probably experienced that. So you have that passenger in the right-hand side who's stomping their foot on the brake, which is kind of annoying to the driver. But that can also be a very useful cue if the driver is missing the fact that pedestrians crossing in front of them. So that's the difference. A person on a cell phone, on the other hand, would just keep yapping away, which would mean that you might actually miss something in the environment and cause an accident. So I'm going to try and skip over some of this stuff really quickly because it's very much in details in the slides. I don't think you need my narration. But in a quick minute, I want to describe what we've learned about attention through neglect patients. So when patients have epilepsy really badly, as I've mentioned before, you can separate the two hemispheres of the brain with a surgery which keeps the epileptic seizure from spreading. What happens is patients tend to ignore one side of their body or the other. This is called neglect. Now, patients can still process sensory information for both sides of the visual world, but what tends to happen is that you get this competition that happens between the two hemispheres. There is a, sorry, I'm going too fast. There is a good, healthy hemisphere and an injured hemisphere. And so what will happen is, let's say you have an injured right hemisphere, well, the person will not be able to pay attention to the left side of their own body. You can ask them to move their left hand, and they won't do it. You can put their left hand in front of them, and they'll say, "Doctor, whose hand is that?" And they have the ability to see the hand, but they can't pay attention to it because of this particular type of brain damage they have. What's very interesting is that you can relieve this hemi-neglect temporarily by injecting cold water into the ear of the healthy hemisphere. And what this does is this actually stuns the healthy hemisphere and makes the competition between hemispheres a little more fair. And so there's my alarm. And so the unhealthy hemisphere is now allowed to report the fact that it can see a healthy hand. So again, attention is competition for scarce resources, and that can happen within the brain itself.